Okay, so before I get into the message, I have to say, Rebecca, you are due, what, Wednesday? Wednesday. She's doing 3 days. She's up here leading worship. Is that not awesome? With child, could it be holier? It's like the Virgin Mary, except like not, but good work, Tony. So today we're in part 4 of this series. Say it with me. What's it called? Right in the eye. And as I've said, kind of all along, I debated whether to do this series in the middle of a summertime when church attendance is limited for a lot of you because there's a lot going on. Because this is a series where really all the messages are intertwined and interrelated. And so really, if you think of it this way, this whole series is really like one big sermon, like one big message, but because nobody wants to come in the middle of summer and listen to a 4-hour sermon, it's broken into 6 parts, 6 segments. And so today is part 4, which means that if you missed one of the first 3, you could get all caught up if you go to our website, which is just brookviewchurch.com. And of course, if you're here today and you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, this would be so perfect for whoever. Your mom, your husband, your insurance agent, you can always send them the link. I want to launch into today's message with just an observation about life. And it's simply this, that it's the people or things that capture our attention that ultimately determine our direction. Okay, it's the people or things that capture our attention that ultimately determine our direction. And I love how in our language, in the English language, we like to say that certain things grab our attention or capture our attention. And when something grabs you or captures your attention, there's a sense in which you turn in its direction. Okay, now this is definitely true, and if you're a driver's ed instructor, you know this is true. This is definitely true when it comes to driving a vehicle, right? Like you're driving down a stretch of highway and you see on the left, you see the most magnificent deer. Just this, yeah. Tony. All right, man, so, I don't understand the whole point system for these things. What is that? You just got to count them? Well, that's part of what my problem is. I can't. They start moving, and I'm like, I don't know. But let's say this is on your left. You're driving that highway, and this is on your left, and you are captivated. Question for you. As you stare off to the left of the highway, what happens to the car? It starts veering left. And really, this is the very same thing that happens with our lives, with anything that captivates us. When something grabs or captures our attention, it turns us in its direction. Could be an idea, could be a person, could be a hobby, whatever. In 1998, I went with some good friends of mine to a church conference down in California, and we were all kind of young people that were considering going into full-time ministry, and the church we were at paid for us all to go have this experience because there was this church down there that had done some really cool, really innovative stuff. And as we were at the conference, there was a pastor there that talked about how he started his church, the whole process, all the things that he did, and suddenly an idea captured my attention. Like, what if one day Jen and I started a church? And so suddenly this idea, this vision just grabbed me. And as my friends and I took the 2-day drive together back from California, I was just enthralled with this idea. And what happened is it turned me in its direction. It took me in a completely different direction with my life. Now, sometimes what captures us is really good, right? Sometimes what captures us is really good, but oftentimes it's not so good. I mean, all of us have people or opportunities that came along and they grabbed our attention, and now looking back on it all and where it all led, we wish we would have seen it and said, and just kept going, right? I mean, we wish we would have said, nope, never mind. Never mind. I mean, you think about it. There are people you wish you'd never met, right? There are relationships you wish you'd never had. There are phone calls you wish you had never returned. But something about those people or those opportunities or those situations captured your attention, and it changed your direction. So our direction is determined in large part by what we give our attention to. Now, not only are there things that grab our attention or capture our attention, but also there are things that we choose to pay attention to, right? Where it's very intentional. We choose to pay attention. We choose to give attention. And there's a big difference between something that grabs our attention and what we decide intentionally to give our attention to. And looking back on our lives, I think all of us wish there were certain things we'd given more attention, right? Maybe you wish you'd paid a little more attention to managing money. Maybe you wish you'd paid a little more attention to your health or to your marriage or what's going on with your kids. And so here's the thing. In your life right now, there are things, all kinds of things coming at you that have the potential to capture your imagination and capture your attention. But also there are things that you need to give attention to. You need to pay attention to. And it's interesting because Jesus warns us to be very, very cautious about what gains our attention. He essentially says, hey, listen, what you focus on, what you allow to captivate you, what you think about all the time, whatever it is that becomes really important to you, will affect your heart, and it will eventually affect the entire direction of your life. So he says it this way. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And Jesus continues. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. He says the eye is the lamp of the body because in the ancient world, like when they would go out and they would walk in the dark, they didn't have, there weren't a lot of street lights. And so they would carry these oil lamps out in front to light the way. Sometimes they would put those lamps on a pole so they could see a little bit farther out even. And so here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, okay, your eyes, the things that you see, the things that you gaze at, the things that you choose to give attention to, those are like the lantern of your entire life. What you pay attention to will direct your entire life. Because as the body follows the light, your life will follow whatever it is that you pay most attention to. And so I want to ask a question that I'm sure you all knew was coming. What has your attention these days? What is it you find yourself thinking about all the time? And we're going to come back to that. In this series, we're studying the book of what? Judges. And if you're kind of newer to the Bible, this is not usually the first book that people dive into. And so you may have never read the book of Judges. If you grew up in church, you at least heard a couple of stories, a couple of very interesting stories from Judges. But other than a couple of stories, you might not be all that familiar with it either. So as we've seen throughout the series, the period of Judges was unique. It took place during a very specific time in the history of Israel. Moses had delivered the Israelites from slavery and bondage in Egypt, and then he led them for 40 years through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And just as they were about to go into the promised land, Moses died. So his right-hand man who had been with him through the whole thing, Joshua, led the Israelites into the land. Now, Joshua was very old, so he wasn't going to be around long. And so he kind of got them all settled into their dorm rooms, right? And he got things decorated, and he got them all tucked in with their soft blankies. And he said, now, behave yourselves. And then he drove home. Actually, he went home. He died. And he left them on their own. And it would be 330 years before Israel would have its first king. There'd be Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. But for the first 330 years in the land, there was no king. Israel was ruled by what are called judges. And the idea was that Israel would be very different. God's intention was that Israel would be very different from every other nation because God had led them out of slavery and he had given them his law. And so God would raise up judges to help them stay on track and follow the law, to help them love God and follow him. And unlike any other nation, the idea was that God himself would be their king. God himself would be their king. This would not be a monarchy like every other nation had. It wouldn't be a democracy. This would be a theocracy. Okay, Israel would be his people and God would be their king. And unfortunately, as we've seen, this did not go very well. They sort of went through cycle after cycle after cycle of disobedience, and then that would lead to some sort of disaster. And then they would do what we've all done. They'd call the one that gave them the rules in the first place, whose rules they broke, which caused them to make a mess. Okay, they would call home and be like, Mom, Dad, can you help me? Like, yeah, I know what you said. I don't need a lecture. I know what you said. I didn't listen. And now I need your help. Okay, and I'm sorry, so please help. And they'd do, in a sense, what we've all done. They would cry out to God and they would pray and they'd say, God, we're so sorry. We're so sorry. Please help us. And because he's passionate and because he's patient and because he loved them, he would come to their rescue again and again and again and again and again. And the book of Judges ends with this really dark, ominous statement that we've been looking at. In fact, it's a statement that sort of recurs and repeats all through the book of Judges. And the book ends with this. The writer says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So there was no king in Israel. God was supposed to be the king. This was a brand new idea, very different. These people would be set apart. But the people would forget God and they would ignore him again and again and again. And God would raise up these judges, these leaders, and their job was to help the people again focus on the law and to organize the people to help them fight off their enemies because the surrounding nations were always invading and always attacking them. So during the 300-plus period of the judges, turns out there were roughly 12 judges. Two of which were guys named Gideon and Samson. And if you grew up in kids' church, these would be the stories that you heard, Gideon and Samson. We're going to look at the story of Gideon next week. And today we're going to focus on Samson because, you guys, this is a fascinating story. And the truth is, there's a little Samson in every one of us. Now, Samson's story starts like a lot of famous Bible stories. Like once upon a time, there was a man and his wife, and they couldn't have children. So an angel of God shows up and says, you are going to have a son, and he's going to be special, which is sort of obvious, right? I mean, when an angel shows up to announce the birth of your child, that child is going to be special. So he's like, God is up to something. He has a special plan and a special purpose. And so the angel said, the Spirit of God is going to rest on your son in a very unique way. He will be a Nazirite from birth. So that means that Samson would take this thing called a Nazirite vow. Do we have that? Yeah, Nazirite vow, which has nothing to do with like Jesus being a Nazarene, okay? A Nazirite vow. This is an ancient Jewish custom that was very, very special, but it was usually taken by a person who was trying to get God's attention. You ever really wanted to get God's attention? So if you were like really praying about something, maybe you're going through something hard, you would take this vow. Maybe for 30 days, maybe if you were really serious, you'd go 90 days. People that were super intense might go as much as a year. So the vow consisted of a few things. You couldn't eat or drink anything from grapes, which for the most part meant you couldn't drink wine. Okay? And then also you couldn't touch anything dead. And then the final thing was you couldn't cut your hair. You had to just let your hair grow and grow and grow. Okay, so then people would see you and they'd see you with your crazy hair and they'd be like, oh, wow, okay, this person has taken a Nazirite vow. This person is like super devoted to God. and trying to get God's attention. And again, people did this maybe for 30 days, maybe a month, maybe 90 days, maybe a year. But we're told that Samson was a Nazirite. He took the Nazirite vow from birth. So like just when he was old enough to understand, his parents had to like pull him aside and explain, hey, the reason you look different from all the other boys is because God told us that he's going to do something very special through you, son. Very special. So you have taken the Nazirite vow from birth because God has set you apart. So all growing up, he was told, don't drink anything from grapes. Don't touch anything dead. And don't cut your hair. Because God is going to do something very, very special through you. Now, it's interesting because Samson in this story is kind of like a microcosm of Israel. I mean, his life really mirrored the life of his people. I mean, God had chosen Israel to be unique and set apart, right? Well, God had chosen Samson to be unique and set apart. God wanted Israel to do something great in the world, and he wanted Samson to do something great. God wanted Israel to be a light to all the other nations. God wanted Samson to be a light to all the people of Israel. The nation of Israel would be powerful and it would be wealthy. This was God's ideal. And the other people from the other nations, because this is their theology, this is how they determined whether a God was strong or not. The other people would look and they'd say, wow, like their God must be strong. Their God must be the real God. And then they would look deeper and see in Israel, they would see compassion and justice and mercy like there was in no other nation. And they would begin to learn about God's heart. That was the idea. Well, in the same way, Samson would be this guy who is strong and yet compassionate. He'd be powerful yet merciful. He would protect and defend. He would fight for justice for the people that no one was fighting for. And people would begin to see God's heart. And they would remember, oh yeah, our God is good. Our God is the true God. But the other way Samson reflected Israel during the period of the Judges was that just like how Israel took their eyes off of God, off of his law, and started looking around at other nations and just emulating them, in the same way, Samson started to stray and look around and copy the lifestyles that he saw around him. And Samson's big problem was women. Samson could not keep his eyes off of Philistine women. And what happened was, when he was young, it was like obvious that he was stronger than everybody else. And here's my theory about Samson. This is just a theory. It's not really critical for the story. But if you think about it, if you see a guy that is just huge, I mean, just ripped, and you look at that guy and he can lift heavy things, you don't wonder, well, how in the world did he do that? Right? You know how he did it. He's huge. He's ripped. Okay, but if you see somebody like me, and I'm lifting crazy heavy stuff, you're like, okay, now that must be a miracle, right? That, or maybe a magic trick. And so, guys, I'm just throwing this out there. I think Samson looked a little bit like me. And not just me, probably most of you. I mean, there's a lot of you that are kind of out of shape, too. So I don't think that people just looked at Samson and went, oh, wow, that guy's huge. Of course he can lift all this stuff. That dude's a freak. Like, I don't think that Samson, when we're envisioning him, was like Israel's version of Goliath. I think he looked kind of plain. I think he looked kind of average. So that when the Spirit of God rested on him and he does these crazy feats of strength, everybody looks around and goes, what is God doing? So Samson has this superhuman strength. And for his first job, he's a border guard between Israel and Philistia, because one of their main enemies was the Philistines. And we see very quickly that Samson became a leader. He was like crazy strong, but he also had these leadership skills, this ability to organize people and inspire people. And so he became a judge in Israel. And he started as a border guard, and his main problem was he wouldn't stay on his side of the border. Like every once in a while, and maybe a little more often than every once in a while, at night, he'd creep down into the Philistine villages and one of these border towns where all of these Philistine women were. And he kept getting himself into trouble. In fact, the very first event we're told about from his life is this. It says, Samson went down to Timnah. Okay, so he leaves the border and heads down into Philistine territory, and he saw there a young Philistine woman. Then he went back home, and when he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now go get her for me as my wife. And his faithful, God-fearing Jewish parents, right, father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable a woman among your relatives? And so clearly they lived in southern Israel. Right? Okay. If you're from the south, don't hate me. Joe, I love you guys, okay? Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives? Or, okay, among our people. We can go outside of our relatives if you want. Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? And they're just horrified that he would want to intertwine his life with a godless woman who worshiped other gods. And circumcision was this sign between the Jews and God. It was a sign of their special relationship with him. So they don't want Samson marrying outside the faith. And this is not an indictment on interracial marriage. God wasn't against that. The problem was that when Israelite men married foreign women, the foreign women would bring their gods and their spirituality with them. They'd bring their idols and their religion. And what would happen is they would turn the hearts of the men of Israel away from God. And Moses had warned about this, and Joshua had warned about this, over and over. If you guys start marrying women who don't love God, who don't know God, who follow other gods, it's going to be a real problem for you. And that's what Samson's parents are saying. Son, remember the law. This is part of the law. Remember to serve God fully. Remember, he wants to do something special through you, so be wise. See, by the time of Samson, this was a huge problem. And this is part of what caused Israel to go through this cycle of disaster over and over and over and over. And so his parents were just also, in case you haven't noticed, we're actually at war with the Philistines. That's why you're guarding the border. So, you should stay on the border. And they're do we really have to explain this to you? But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Now, the little Hebrew phrase translated right one for me is interesting because it's similar to that other recurring phrase in Hebrews where the writer keeps saying that people continually did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, Samson sees this woman and he's like a microcosm of the whole nation, and he says, I see her, she's what I want, I'm going to do whatever I want, so mom and dad, go down there and get her for me. Well, the whole story is just a disaster. So they go, and he gets married, and so, of course, she wants to have the wedding at her church, right? With her family on her side of the border. And so his family goes on down there, and they do this. But then they're at war with the Philistines, so that's tricky. So Samson, while he's at this, he can't help himself. And he humiliates the Philistines. And so they kick him out, but they keep his wife. And they marry her off to someone else. And at the very end of the story, she's burned alive because of her association with Samson. So that relationship didn't really work out. Next story. He goes down into Philistine territory again, slips over the border. He goes down and he spends the night with another Philistine woman. And this is just kind of his life. And the Philistines, they find out and they hate Samson Because of him, thousands of their men have died, and their economy has been brutally impacted by him. He's like public enemy number one. So one night, he's spending the night with this Philistine woman, and they find out he's there, and they surround the whole city. They're making sure there's no way out. They are going to kill Samson. But he uses this God-given power that he has for his own agenda. And it works out. He ends up getting out of this predicament. But he just has like women problems everywhere he goes. He just continually does whatever is right in his own eyes. And he disregards the fact that God had called him to do something unique for his people. And then the story just slows way down when he meets his most famous partner, Delilah. Now, I'm going to tell you guys this story, and I know some of you are familiar with it. But when you read this story for the first time, you honestly think to yourself, how could any man be so stupid? And so let me just ask you, is it possible that a man could be so sexually inflamed that he would make one stupid decision after another regarding one woman? And men, the answer to that question is yes. It is completely possible for a man to get so sexually inflamed, so enamored with one woman's body that he would do stupid things. And this is a story of male stupidity on steroids. Okay, but I'm telling you, you read this story, when you first read it, you think that can't possibly be true. But here's what I'll tell you, the longer I live and the more stories I hear, I honestly look at this, I go, this story might be average. This might not even be extraordinary. And here's part of why I think this is. God created men with powerful sexual wiring. In fact, men are really very simple. And ladies, in case you don't understand, let me give you the truth about men. Okay? This is for free. You're going to thank me for the rest of your life. Men are simple. Okay? Men are simple. We need only three things, okay? We need three things. We need food, okay? We need sex, and every once in a while, we need a pat on the head. You know what I mean by a pat on the head? Oh, Timmy, you're so smart. That was so good, and you're so strong, and you're so brave, and I saw the way you ran that touchdown. It was so good. You're such a good boy. Timmy, I love that sermon. You are amazing. Come on. Well, this is true, right? We really are simple. Because really, this is all we need. We need food, we need sex, and a pat on the head. And I just want to say, if we could only choose one of the three, we'd probably starve to death. Okay, that's all I'm saying. Okay, so can we just be honest? Men have an amazingly powerful appetite. And when that gets all stirred up and it gets inflamed, it can cause men to do incredibly stupid things, just like one stupid decision after another. So that's Samson. So here's what happened. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the valley of Sorek is in Philistine country. So again, he's going where he shouldn't go, and he's looking at stuff he shouldn't be looking at. And he falls in love with Delilah. Now this time, he's really in love. This is true love. He's really in love. It's okay, yeah, that other stuff, I'm so sorry about the fire and everything. But this woman, Delilah, she has captured my whole heart, and I am in love. But Delilah is a Philistine, and so as they do, the Philistines catch wind of this. And they come to Delilah. And here's what happened. The rulers of the Philistines, and there were probably 5 of them, 5 rulers, went to her and said, See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver, which translates roughly to about $90,000. It's a little tricky to calculate the inflation over 3,300 years. So the Philistines, they enlist Delilah as like a secret agent, right? This is exciting, like a spy. And when you look at the story, you realize her training might have been a little bit primitive and a little bit rushed. Because check this out. It says, here's how she did it. So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Genius. Now, we read that, right? We read that and we think, really? Really? Like, could she have been that obvious? But let me just say, I don't think that this conversation happened over coffee. I love you, Rebecca. They were probably, okay, this is probably in the heat of the moment, and there's probably a lot of alcohol involved. So really, a question that should have made Samson come to his senses didn't. So Samson answered her, "Well, if anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried," which is totally random, don't know where he came up with that, "I'll be as weak as any other man." Saying, I have the potential, even though the very Spirit of God rests on me, I have the potential, even though my birth was forecast by an angel, I have the potential, even though God has called me to carry out an extraordinary task and given me extraordinary gifts, I have the potential to be like every other man, like everybody else. We're like, come on, Samson. Like the clue phone is ringing for you. Like, do you hear yourself? Why would you even mess around with all of that? Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. So one night, after a real wild night, and they'd been at it all night, and he's drunk, and he's passed out, and she sneaks over to the closet or underneath the bed or whatever, and she pulls out the bowstrings, and she ties him up. And it says, with men hidden in the room, which is a little creepy, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame, so the secret of his strength was not discovered. Now that's where the story should go. And so Samson realized she doesn't really love me. And he decided, I'll never cross the border into that area where the Philistines live again. But no. Then Delilah came to Samson. This is awesome. "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He says, "Well, it's actually not bowstrings, it's new rope. Like if you tie me up with new rope, I'll become as weak as any other man." And so what do you know? She gets herself some new rope, and he gets drunk again and passes out again, and she ties him up. "Samson, Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And he jumps up and he pops the new rope and he chases off the Philistines. And now Delilah's starting to get upset. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me, how can you be tied?" So he says, "Well, what you need is a sewing machine. And you take 7 locks of my hair," and so now he's getting close. And you sew them together using the machine, and we're not really sure what that even meant. "And if you do that, I'll become as weak as any other man." And so what do you know? She gets herself a sewing machine, and he falls asleep again, and she does the whole deal with the locks of his hair. And this is where you're going, okay, this story can't be real. No man is that stupid. But there are a few men in this room right now going, okay, well, if you heard my story. And then she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? Poor Delilah. This is the third time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret to your great strength. And now this is the part in the Bible, like this next part's just right out of the Bible. And so I'm not trying to do anything with this. Ladies, I just want to forewarn you. There's nothing intended by me on this, but Scripture says, with such nagging, and, I don't know who decided to emphasize that word. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. Okay, so like when the sex didn't work, it's the nagging that got him. And I just want to say, ladies, and I think you know this, but in a serious moment for a second, you guys have such power. Man, is that true? You have so much power. And so I would just encourage you to be as thoughtful as you can about what you do with that power, how you use that power. Because God has given you power with your words, with your body, with your sexuality. And that's such a gift from God to be used for great things. But you can also use that to manipulate. Okay, you can use it to tear down. And so you should be really, really thoughtful. Okay, so Delilah. She combines the body with the nagging, and finally he's like, okay, whatever. So he says, no razor has ever been used on my head, because I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. Okay, at which point he should have been like, you know what? Oh yeah, I'm a miracle. Like my birth is a miracle. My parents were barren and they were infertile, and God stepped in and did something extraordinary. I mean, my goodness, an angel came and predicted my birth. And all of this so that I could be set apart and do special things for my people, for Israel. So what in the world am I doing here? How stupid have I been? I'm on the wrong side of the border with the wrong people doing the wrong things. And every time I say something to this chick, my enemies start closing in. He should have been like, come on, Samson, think. He says, if my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. Honestly, the truth is, I could be just like everybody else. So they have another passionate night, and he's drunk again, and he passes out, and she gets out her razor, and she's dreaming of what she's going to do with her money. And she cuts his hair, and she yells, Samson, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And the author tells us Samson jumped up just like he had before. But see, I don't think he was ripped. I don't think he was this massive, huge guy, because obviously he didn't know. He didn't know that he'd lost it. He jumps up and he looks and feels the same as ever, and he's like, Philistines, right? When are they going to learn? But the Spirit of God had left him. The Spirit of God had left him, we're told. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And I don't know, maybe I've seen too many movies, but I wonder if the last thing that he saw was Delilah. And maybe the last thing that he thought was, how did I not see this coming? And maybe he realized in an expression of my freedom, in an abuse of the gift that God has given me, I've become a captive to the very people whose lifestyle I tried to copy. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. And Samson died in shackles. And that was the end of his opportunity to be everything God had called him to be. Now, here's why I think this story is such a vivid picture for us. Guys, the reality is you have no idea what God wants to do in your life. You have no idea what God wants to do in your life. You have no idea what God wants to do through you. You have no idea what God wants to do through the next generation that comes from you. You have no idea what God would do if you would look and you would say with sincerity to God, God, I'm going to surrender to you my whole heart. God, I'm going to entrust to you my whole heart. I'm even going to entrust to you the expressions of my sexuality. God, I'm going to entrust everything to you. So strengthen me, God, and use me. Because I want to go where you want me to go. I want to do what you want me to do. I want to use the gifts that you've given me to serve you, to serve the people that you love. So God, would you please guide me? Would you please set my direction? You have no idea what God would do in and through you. And I want to come back to the idea that just sort of led us down this road today. The truth is, it's the people or things that capture our attention that ultimately determine our direction. So again, when it comes to you, what has your attention these days? What do you spend most of your time thinking about? What do you spend most of your time looking at? What's captivating you? Because here's what I know. Whatever captivates your attention, it will eventually turn you in its direction. So what needs more of your attention and what needs less? And for some of you, if you ponder that in this moment, it's not obvious to you. But even so, I would really invite you to think it over. For others of you, you know the answer to that immediately. It's been jumping out this whole time. It's as clear as day. Something in your world needs more attention and something needs less. And it could not be more obvious to you. And I just want to say, what if that's the Spirit of God guiding you? And what if He's really trying to lead you to good things, to great things? What if what He's doing is He's trying to give something to you? What if that nagging fear that you have, the one that worries that He's trying to keep something from you, what if that's actually all wrong? What if it couldn't be more wrong? What if it's totally backwards? What if He's just trying to give something to you? And what if it's always, always, always simply been about that? Father in heaven, I thank you